Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you. 3 years ago, I decided to have my second retirement and quit from the venture capital firm I co-founded and started Evolve Ventures and Foundation. I set aside $100 million to give this a try. And the reason I left the venture firm I started was that I was managing other people's money. So I had a fiduciary duty to them to maximize shareholder return. And that limited me from doing a lot of things I wanted to do, particularly as I was deep in my own personal journey and found increasingly doing the pure capitalist kind of a thing didn't resonate with me. There was a divide between my outer world and my inner world. So I thought, well, I'll give this a try, and I'll dedicate the investments and support only for conscious businesses. That was the only thing we would do. We would not invest in any other kinds of companies, even at the risk of sub-optimizing return. So I'm here to tell you a few things I have learned in that process in the past 3 years, and also talk about my personal journey a little bit, that how I got to here and the implications for my learning in the process as well. So the first thing I think I learned was conscious businesses are hard. Conscious capitalism is really hard. I guess if we're easy, everybody would be doing it, right? Because who doesn't want a higher purpose for their business? Who doesn't want to please and serve all stakeholders? But the reality is very different, at least in the current world. Some of the things you would know will be, shareholder activism and shareholder agitation, which even created problems for Whole Foods a few years ago. That eventually led to the sale to Amazon. Competitors would do anything to compete, while a conscious business will be limited in what they can do. So I know somebody by the name of Philip Rosedale. He was the founder of something called Second Life. I don't know if you somebody heard of Second Life. It's a virtual world before virtual world became popular. And now he's starting a company called High Fidelity, which is trying to create a virtual world, real virtual world, to compete with some of the Facebook things some of the things that Facebook is doing. And what he told me was it's really hard because he knows some of the tricks to get customers to come back and to engage. And these are the tricks that Facebook uses all the time to get you to be on the phone all the time. But he said, I choose not to use them. But then how do I compete with Facebook, who can use those tricks? And that happens in many industries. And I think that one of the most tricky challenges of a conscious business I found was that actually even your consumers, your customers, work against you. So I recently saw my daughter eating Cheetos, and I looked at the list of ingredients. I cannot even pronounce most of the ingredients. That's a pretty bad sign. It's fat, sugar, salt, right? I tried one, and as I was eating it, I can almost feel like my arteries hardening, my insulin level spiking, my heart-owned muscles going flabby. It's really bad for you. But she loves it, right? Because we don't always do things that we need to do that's good for us. We have a certain biological system, a dopamine system, a sugar reward system that makes us want things that's actually not good for us. And that creates a huge challenge for a conscious business. Because imagine everybody only does things or consume things that's good for them. Then you can market as much as you want, and you'll be okay, you'll be serving them. But imagine a world where it is today, where we have this body that's adapted for the Africa savanna, and now in this world which is full of sugar, full of Facebook likes that will give us dopamine hits, all these things, it's very hard for a consumer to make the right choice. And when they don't make the right choices, it makes it really hard for a conscious business to operate. Because you can give them the healthiest thing, but it cannot compete with the fat and the sugar and the salt in some of these snacks. And if you think about supposedly higher purpose, it's easy to talk about higher purpose. But Purdue Pharma, for example, which was behind many of the, you're aware of the opioid crisis. Purdue Pharma marketed OxyContin and fentanyl and all these things, which led to about last year, 90,000 people died from overdose, of which 70% are opioid overdoses. So 70,000 people, 60,000 died in America alone from opioid overdose. And Purdue Pharma and a few other pharma companies were responsible for the over-aggressive marketing tactics they had. But Purdue Pharma, was all about reducing pain. It's very high. That's a higher purpose, right? Reducing pain and suffering. In fact, one of their marketing slogans was "Hope in a Bottle." It was very effective. There was a higher purpose there. But when did they lose their way? Facebook is about connecting people. That's also a very higher, good-sounding purpose. And I think a lot of people actually believe it in Facebook. But of course, it led to a loneliness epidemic, a disconnection with reality in some ways, and certainly with real friends. And for example, teenage suicide have gone up, particularly amongst girls, more than doubled in the past decade. More than doubled. Teenage suicides amongst girls. Boys increased about 40%. And it's pretty hard to figure out, see what could be cause of it other than the rise of social media, which girls use far more than boys. But Facebook is, and of course, Facebook also creating all these divides in our politics, and it's not about connecting, it's about dividing and loneliness. But it has a higher purpose of connecting people. So in my own investment process, I found that it's really, really hard for a company to stick with its knitting. It's easy to talk about serving shareholders and stakeholders and higher purpose and all that. But actually, when it gets to KPIs, quarterly pressures, competitive pressure, it's really hard. So my second finding, it was that I think really the only way to stick with conscious business and to be able to execute and sustain oneself and enjoy it in the process is if the founder or the executive engages a continual inner journey of growth. You call it inner work. We could call it inner work. But what do I mean by inner work? I would use my own story maybe to illustrate it. I think at least three components inner work that there's a sequence to it, but also there's a lot of interplay of the inner work. The first one is opening one's heart. And the second is understanding one's history. And third is transcending oneself. So I'll talk about that briefly using my own experience. So opening one's heart. I sold my first company when I was 29. I retired. I sold it for a good deal of money, and I was very lucky and retired. And I somehow expected my life to be a little different. But actually it wasn't. It was the same old life after the first initial euphoria for a week. I started having children around that time. And I discovered I still could not connect with them. Doesn't really matter my external success, whatever. I could not spend, I had a lot of time to spend with them, but I couldn't really be a good parent in the way they need me. I couldn't connect, I couldn't enjoy being a father. I just need to teach them things. I could discipline, but I did not really know. And when my wife asked me to go spend time with the kids, I actually felt resentful. It's like, I don't want to spend time with them. I noticed that I was still very judgmental and irritated when the smallest things don't go my way. I would point at people, they did this wrong, this person cut in front of me, blah, blah, blah. And the same kind of agitation and judgment. Eventually, it took me a while. I came to realize that my heart was pretty closed. That actually I was pretty extreme, that I didn't have many feelings actually. I don't know, some of you might experience it. Certainly Silicon Valley, a lot of people are like that. That actually they don't even have much sad, there are certain feelings we allow ourselves to feel, maybe anger for some people, maybe kind of a excitement for others. But sadness, true joy, true presence of peace and all these, we actually don't allow ourselves to feel very much, or vulnerable or sad. A lot of things we don't even feel ourselves. We sort of close our hearts because too often it can be too painful to open it. And actually, I think the more successful in some ways one become, the riskier it is to open one's heart. Because so many other people could take advantage of you, or they could want something from you. And so I think I started experimenting. It's a long story, which I won't go into, about opening my hearts. And that led to a lot of different changes. And my relationship with my kids completely changed. And also, it enabled me to connect with a purpose that's a little bit deeper than my mind-based focus. When people ask me, what's your passion or whatnot, often our answer comes from the mind. What I like to do, what's my purpose, there's a kind of a mind-based answer. But there's also a heart-based answer that sticks around much more than a mind-based answer. And to me, that has made a whole difference in my world, in my relationship with people. And I think if I were honest, I would say 10 years ago, I actually probably didn't really have real friends. Of course, I know a lot of people, all that kind of things, and I will hang out with a few people and all that stuff. But really, that I could be really open with, can share my most vulnerable thoughts, and have this deep personal connection. I can look in this person's eyes and having that deep, incredible, instead of just talking business or even talking about raising children or going to school, whatever, but really deep connections, really deep personal connections. I didn't have any. And that has changed. And I found that to be probably the most important thing I did in the past 10 years. The second one, understanding one's history, was also extremely helpful because it enabled me to understand how I became who I was. So, for example, I said, no, I didn't feel like myself had many friends, or real friends. It had a lot to do with how I was brought up. My father was angry all the time, and he suffered a lot in the Cultural Revolution in China, so he said friends are useless. He didn't allow me much social interaction when I was in school. I had one play date, and then he forbid it afterwards. And my mom was a bit disassociated because she had so much suffering in her life that the only way for her to deal with it was by closing herself down. You couldn't fight and couldn't flee, so the only way is to freeze and to close one down. And so the young me had nobody to really connect with when I was 2 or 3 or 5, probably even more important when I was 2 or 1. They were there. They were always present. They were loving, but there's a part of them was closed, and I couldn't really connect. I remember one time, I went to Harvard and then came back to China after the freshman year summer, and I told my mother that, there was a girl from high school that I really wanted to go get back in touch with. I was always a little fascinated by her, and now I was a little confident in myself since I came from Harvard. I can go chase after her a little bit, right? And I remember my mother asked me a question what is she like? And I was so surprised because she never engaged me in these conversations before. I would say something since I was young, she wouldn't engage. She will talk about other things schoolwork or whatever. She would not engage in this. So I was surprised by my surprise, if you understand what I mean. So there are many other stories that have more time I'll share, but so understanding how sort of the process I grew into who I was super helpful for me to transcend, actually not transcend is not the word, for me to not be beholden to the power suit that I built up. Right? And I use the word power suit, or some people use the word mask, is that I think all of us, since we're young, we build up a protection so that we don't get hurt and we get praise and rewards. And all of us do, and that's the right thing to do. And depending on our family and social cultures and schools, these, and also our own inherent inclination, these power suits take different forms and shapes. And that's very useful. Definitely don't throw that away. But the tragedy is that over time, first of all, that power suit certainly prevents us from opening our hearts. And secondly, is that we sort of mistake that power suit or that mask for who we are. And that's the biggest tragedy, really, of all humanity, is we mistake the egoic structure that we build for who we are. And that egoic structure is fragile, needs constant maintenance, has lots of fears, and can be easily triggered because there's certain patterns that's built into that egoic structure since we were a child. So it can be triggered into whether it's depression or anger or agitation. I used to have what I call constipated anger. Right? It's like I was angry all the time, really, to be honest. But anger was not good, and I wanted to be good since I was very small. So I would say I was frustrated. It's really just, it's really just like this kind of thing, but I can't express it in a way. Actually, anger is powerful. If you can express anger in the right way, anger is a source of incredible power to do things in the world when you see injustice. But I sort of compress that into constipation. So the last thing that leads naturally to is transcendence. Right? I think many of you might have heard of Maslow's hierarchy, and people start with survival and social instincts and then self-actualization. That was at the peak. But actually, in the last few years of Maslow's life, he had interaction with a number of spiritual masters, and he started talking about self-transcendence as the ultimate goal. And I think most people are actually not aware of it, which is sort of a sad thing. And I know even some of the big movements in the world, including the Koch brothers, funding of the Republican Party and everything, is based on self-actualization. There's a lot of self-actualization behind a lot of the politics, which is totally valid. But self-transcendence, it was what Maslow realized is the ultimate goal. And what I mean by self-transcendence, and that takes, I don't know, that's actually, it's hard to describe it with using words. But when we look underneath, if you will, that power suit, what is there? Right? If we look beyond the ego, which psychology, of course, has a lot to say about the ego and the super ID or whatever it is, what's there? Right? It's a mystery that I think some people call it by different names. I will name them because the soul or true nature or Buddha nature or whatever you call it. But there's something inside of us that's indestructible, timeless, full of love. It has an inherent peace to it. It doesn't need anything to make it better. And when we can operate from that place in business, instead of having business success being a confirmation of our value and fearful that if we fail or if we don't do as well with our compared to our competitors, then we have no value. That actually we know we have value, has nothing to do with what we do, and we have a unique gifts to give in the world. but then you operate from that place, it feels very, very different. And the actions we take become very, very different. And even if we end up doing the same thing, our internal states make it different, very, very different. And I think for me, conscious capitalism means that, is operating from that place. If we don't operate from that place, it's pretty hard to sustain what we do in the world, I think. We can talk nicely and everything like Facebook and whatnot does, but when it gets to everyday things we do in life, it's very difficult. And so why I do Evolve was to, we only invest in conscious businesses defined as businesses that's led by a founder or founders that are in the journey of transformation. You call it self-transcendence or you call it self-inquiry or growth. But whose also the business purpose is to elevate consciousness. So could be through a meditation app, could be around parenting to prevent harm being done to kids, which is pretty incredible, or could be in helping depressed women in Uganda, anything to do from all the spectrum. Like people, sometimes we talk about it's mental health, sometimes we say it's inner well-being, sometimes we say it's personal growth, and sometimes we say it's spirituality in certain audiences. I don't know this audience I'm allowed to say that word or not. But to me, all four things mean the same thing. Mental health, inner well-being, personal growth, spirituality. There's all of them, there's none of these without the other. It's all together. It means the same thing. It's just whether you take a scientific point of view or you take a more, heart-based, transcendent point of view. It's really, to me, the same thing. And I think I like to close with one of my favorite quotes, which is that no problems can be solved by the same level of consciousness that created it. It's frequently attributed to Einstein, but I've never been able to find out exactly when and where actually Einstein said it. But it sounds really good. And since I can't find out what he meant by it, I can freely use my own interpretation, right? And in the context of capitalism, I would say that capitalism in the context of, meaning that Adam Smith, we all for ourselves, we are this individual, egoic being. We need to make ourselves successful and rich and successful and sustainable. Then we do things for ourselves, but then eventually an invisible hand works so that the economy, whole thing works. It's beautiful. It created incredible wealth and well-being for 200 years. But it was created with a certain level of consciousness. And we're seeing the challenges that come from that capitalism. It has lots of good things. By no means, I have good capitalist credentials, so I can't criticize capitalist things. But definitely incredible things. When I think about even the pen being made today involves probably millions of people, from all the way from miners to transportation to smelters to, you name it, factories. Like the amount of coordination needed under capitalism to create these things is incredible. Right? The way to organize human beings in a concerted effort to create something incredibly complex, that there's no way any one person can do this on their own, or 10,000 people in it. It's incredible. But there's a certain level of consciousness that created it. And it's now creating problems of the environment, a sense of loneliness, incredible divide in our politics, despair, anger, all those things. You could say it sort of came from that place because our social economic system also determines our political system to some certain extent, and certainly our social discourse. So can we, and then that capitalism locks us up in a certain consciousness that created it. It sort of reinforces this level of consciousness. So if we want to change capitalism into conscious capitalism, or whatever you call it, it requires us to get to a different level of consciousness. We call it evolve, meaning evolving our consciousness. Can we continue to evolve our consciousness? And starts with each individual person in this room. And I'm certainly not evolved by any means. I'm evolving. I'm definitely not enlightened or realized. Though I do just have some spiritual moments, but I'm far from being evolved. But evolving, I'm proud to say. And I think the only way for us to build a better world and change some of, deal with some of the biggest challenges in the world, including the environment or inequality or of the AI looming incredible things AI could do or create risk for us, or CRISPR, and all these things require humanity to work together. And the only way to work together, I think, and create also more beautiful things, not just the harm reduction or risk reduction, but also incredible beautiful things, is and give everybody a chance to give their unique gifts to the world, whether that person is born in Africa or in America, is, I think, if all of us start working on our inner journeys. And I hope that we, I admire all of you here because you are at the forefront of that movement, and I wish you the best of luck. And tomorrow I'll be the deep dive if you guys wanted to ask more questions or want to share anything else. Thank you.